she walked down the aisle believing every promise she'd ever whispered to herself that this was the day, the small apartment, the long nights, the scholarship letters would finally fold into something that looked like forever. The cathedral smelled of lilies and beeswax. Light fractured through the stained glass in long, colored knives. 200 faces leaned forward, waiting for the moment 2 lives would be joined. Then a glass tipped. Champagne arced through air and struck the edge of her veil, a sudden, obscene sparkle across white. Laughter, sharp as broken glass, ricocheted down the nave. They called it a wedding. For Clare Bennett, it felt like an ambush. A handsome one she had trusted pulled away at the very second the priest asked if they took each other. The murmur that followed was not confusion. It was a planned signal. A woman at the front row leaned in and said 2 words loud enough for the nearest pews to hear. "Not ours." Someone else started clapping. Carefully staged applause that sounded like knives. A tall man in a tailored jacket stepped forward and, with the casual cruelty of someone used to getting what he wanted, removed Clare's veil. He didn't do it gently. Fabric tore, not with the momentum of accident, but with the intention of exposing something to be mocked. She stood there, hands trembling, the lace at her fingers suddenly heavy as memory. Her face went flush-hot, then cold, then steady, with that odd, inward focus people wear when they're trying to find the ground after a shove. Around her, the Hartwell clan smiled as if they'd rehearsed this moment for years. Gavin Hartwell, her supposed groom, looked at her with the clinical appraisal of a man measuring assets, not vows. He said, plainly, so the whole cathedral could hear, "You were useful. You served us well." The words rolled through the pews and sank into the wooden floor like acid. A glass hit the stone aisle. Champagne, now mingled with flower petals. Someone shouted, "A woman, Amanda!" Gavin's sister stepped back and laughed, delighted by the spectacle she had helped orchestrate. The organ, as if embarrassed, cut off mid. Guests shifted, phone screens rose like a second congregation cataloging the disaster. Claire's mother, sitting in the back, made no sound, but her hands were a white line around her knees. The worst thing was not the tear or the wetness on her bridal sleeve. It was the way people turned away. The human reflex to look somewhere else when they don't know what to do made the humiliation radiate outward, as if the shame could catch and rose like wildfire. You think you know how a story like this ends? Public disgrace, a broken heart, maybe a vow, never to love again? But that day broke an entirely different way. You won't believe who walked through that door. If you love twisty true story style dramas, hit subscribe now. Claire did not always wear a wedding dress when the world watched her. She had learned early that visibility is a currency you spend wisely. At Riverside Technical Institute, she kept a field notebook, cheap cover frayed from being shoved into backpacks and underbeds. The notebook lived in the pocket of a coat she had bought secondhand. The coat had a hole in the lining that let drafts find her ribs. Where other students scheduled internships and brunch, Claire scheduled power outage times when she could focus uninterrupted because there would be no notifications, no group assignments to answer. She learned to work while the city slept. She learned to be brilliant when no one expected brilliance from someone who paid for every textbook with a scholarship check and a part-time at the campus lab. Gavin met her in the lab, like so many stories that later get called fate. He introduced himself like a man dropping a business card. Confident, attentive, the kind of person who noticed the way her name was spelled on the project roster and remembered it. He carried a leather satchel and a notebook embossed with a monogram. He asked for help debugging some code. She helped. He was charming in the way practice makes charming. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, he spoke as if everything he said mattered because it had been chosen. There were real moments. Coffee after finals, when the campus emptied and the street lamps made the sidewalks soft. The way Gavin read aloud a Technica passage and laughed when Claire corrected his pronunciation. Delighted. And then kissed her like he wanted permission to call her brilliant. Study dates turned into walks along the river, hands sliding near each other, conversations spilling from algorithms into family stories. He talked about a future in a voice that assumed a house and a nameplate and children who would study at the best schools. Claire, who had lived on thrift store furniture and the soft, rumbling hum of machines, could not help but be charmed. But there were little fissures she could not ignore. Once, on a walk after a lecture, Gavin said, "We're different, Claire. Not better different. I picture things our way. Your life is a puzzle we could solve another time." When she balked at using his connections for an internship, he shrugged and said, "It's not charity, it's alignment. We don't inherit lives, we take 'em." The phrasing made Claire pause. It suggested that he saw relationships as transactions as much as ascriptions of affection. Her mother, soft-voiced, quick with hand-sewn, mending lasoon to every new detail, with a guarded happiness. "He seems kind," she would say, eyes narrowing like someone checking seams. Once, when Claire mentioned a dinner invitation from the Hartwells, their old money, Gavin had said, "Like that fact was a charmer, mother warned. People with a taste for marble often forget the cost of kindness." Claire laughed it off. "How do you explain to your mother that kindness can be folded into ambition so neatly you don't notice the folds until they cut?" And there was her father, soft-spoken over the phone, distant more by choice than distance. He wrote her letters that were longer than his calls, phrases circled like safety nets. "Observe more than you reveal. Let them show their hand." He meant what he said with a gravity Claire could not translate entirely. There was history there, he chose not to explain. A life of moving through rooms that cost more by the square foot than whole neighborhoods. A life he had left when Claire was tiny so she might not be followed by the same invitation and intrusion he'd seen in his own childhood. He wanted the world to meet Claire without the baggage of his name. "Let me test," he had told her once, a riddle wrapped in concern. Not everything needs to be told at once. So she hid the envelope of advantages that did exist: quiet trust funds, a man who could call a line and make things happen, because part of the joy of her life was that she could be discovered on her own terms. That decision felt like an ethical choice at first. The humility of anonymous success. It became, unknowingly, a risk. Gavin loved her intelligence. He loved how it made him look imaginative in the company of colleagues. To his peers, Claire was an unusual trophy, proof that he could charm talent into his orbit. To Gavin, talent could be elevated into a future asset. Underneath the courtship there was a ledger being written in his head. Proximity, usefulness, how many doors a person could open. The Hartwells themselves lived in a world of polished edges. They did not do messes. Their estate was a white tan-gray statement of intent: marble staircases, a chandelier like a frozen waterfall, a garden trimmed so precisely birds seemed to hesitate before landing. Dinner there felt like a test you were expected to pass without visible effort. Questions came in the measured cadence of people who calibrated their curiosity for efficiency. They asked about internships, about school choices, about Claire's plans, leaned forward and then leaned back with satisfied nods when answers fit expectations. Richard Hartwell had been a man comfortable in boardrooms where the stakes were 1,000-digit tall, but pride, mixed with poor counsel and a few bad investments, had bitten at him. There were creditors he didn't invite into the front hall. There were whispered concerns at the firm about margins shrinking and leverage increasing. Desperation, when polished in that house, still had the shine of strategy. Richard saw Claire's marriage to Gavin as a consolidation not only of family but of salvage. He had a plan. He said it in the kind of private meeting that smelled of old leather and newer anxiety. The plan was arithmetic on a napkin. A long-term contract, a purchase that could return the firm's balance to a comfortable hum again. There was a name attached to the purchase, but Richard kept it guarded, like a secret ingredient. He needed a handshake with someone who could move markets with a signature. The terms that arrived were dizzying numbers Claire could barely hold in her head when she glimpsed them later in a news headline. A contract big enough to tilt the company's fortunes. There was a catch. The potential buyer wanted an introduction to the family's future generation. Our children. The message had set an alignment of families, as if business wished to be married to legacy. The Hartwells suggested a simple, clinical solution. If Gavin were not embarrassed by Claire's origins, then there was the possibility of a match, and a match would steer the negotiation to closed. Richard moved from negotiation to plotting like a man who believed the world could be tidied by removing a single item. It was at this point the arithmetic took a human form that flattened Claire into an instrument. The plan, cruel in its elegance, was to stage a public rupture that could be controlled as a spectacle. Clare, in a way the Hartwells believed, would not only spare Gavin's social standing but present him with an opening to be available to the buyer's world. They rehearsed the sentences they would throw, like nets. They timed the insults to make them seem spontaneous. They planned for plausible deniability, for polite clucking at newspapers, for statements about irreconcilable differences that read like business minutes. What Richard did not fully understand was the economy of underestimation. The price you pay when you assume the one you slight is a blank ledger. He assumed Clare's secrecy was an asset he could exploit. He misread the set of margins he'd trampled on love, loyalty, pride, the quiet reserves of people he had never truly known. In the Hartwell boardroom, desperation translated to a plan. In Clare's world, desperation had a different texture. Nights with roommates, mornings with bus passes, a complicated calculus of emotional labor with none of the entitlement that wealth sometimes breeds. The two values did not meet on the same plane. Gavin, for his part, liked to believe he was navigating destiny. He saw the plan as necessary sacrifice, the kind of sterilized cruelty rationale men tell themselves when their careers demand a certain purity of association. He told himself he would be kind afterward, the kind of kindness that buys forgiveness with time. He did not comprehend that kindness is not a currency he could spend to annul the wound he intended to make. The wedding day was the culmination of the Hartwells' strategy. Invitations had been handled with surgical precision. The right list, the right press release, the right social media accounts, primed to show smiling families and white favors. Clare's parents were present, but at a distance, seated in the church shadows as if they were chaperones at an opera. Clare's mother kept her hands clasped, knuckles white, but her eyes were on Clare with something like an electric current of fear and admiration. Her father sat still, his jaw set. He had been uncharacteristically insistent that Clare not reveal everything about her family. Let them show us who they are. He had told her in a low voice the night before. There is a test in their treatment of you. Let them take it. There was a moral ambiguity to his instruction that sat uneasily in Clare's chest. On the one hand, there is wisdom in seeing what others choose to reveal about themselves when no one is watching. On the other, there is a cruelty in making your child the instrument of discovery. He had meant to protect her, to watch for signs of exploitation. He had not, she thought, meant for the learned signs to become a public spectacle. If he had, he would have warned her not to take an aisle at all, yet he had trusted Clare to carry the choice. She had wanted, above all, to make a life on her own merits. The week leading to the ceremony blurred into precise choreography. Dress fittings in which Clare tried to feel like herself in silk, last-minute seating charts hashed over with a trembling hand. A rehearsal in which Gavin smiled, the rehearsed smile of a man who knew exactly how to live in front of cameras. Clare, prepared and quiet, a hairpin here, a prayer there. A moment alone, in the bridal suite where she put on the dress that a neighbor had helped alter so it fit her unaccustomed shoulders. There were signs that should have been heeded. A change in Gavin's tone that read like a man practicing the word apology as if it were an ad. A private phone call he kept returning to, his jaw clenched in a way that said business worries had nested inside affection. Clare's mother, when she came to pin a corsage, whispered, "Trust your instincts." Clare smiled and tried to make the smile hold. No one could have known how carefully the Hartwells had planned the timing of each slight. The insults were surgical. Amanda's laugh was placed like punctuation. A bridesmaid arranged at a certain seat coughingly revealed a rumor about a scholarship story the newspapers had rewritten into fiction. The guests, like a choir, trained to resonance, took their cue and leaned into condemnation. It was communal performance art, and Clare, in white, became the statue they chose to crack. As the priest asked the old, sacred questions, Clare's mind did a curious, slow thing. It catalogued, not memories so much as a ledger of sensations. The way the dress pinched at her hip, the shift in the light where the organ stopped, the sound of Amanda's voice, thin and clipped, a child's toy rolling under a pew, forgotten, her breath, the tempo of it, like a metronome, trying to keep her present. She tasted salt and something metallic fear, grief, adrenaline braided together. The sound of a camera shutter became a punctuation, a small mechanical verdict. Gavin's words, so casual, so devastating, fell into the hollows people leave for public embarrassment. He stepped back from the vows and announced, with a calmness that suggested rehearsal, that their plans were no longer aligned. His voice was the voice of a man for whom reputations were engines you refueled with apologies and distance. Claire's name felt like a ledger entry he'd erased to balance a portfolio. What followed was a cascade the Hartwells had prepared for. The pulling away as if he had been the one wronged, the carefully timed jeer from an aunt who had never liked Claire's hometown clothes, the collective gasp that was less about shock and more about the spectacle of being allowed to witness downfall. But there were fissures in their plan the Hartwells had not seen. A child in the third row, lonely because the ceremony was long, began to hum a tune too loudly, oblivious to adult cruelty. A guest who had no stake watched a woman humiliated and felt, with sudden shame, the urge to stand. Claire's mother moved, then not theatrically, not to make a scene. She stood because a mother stands when a child needs balance. Her foot found the aisle, as if tugged by gravity. 2 rows over, an old friend, a man who had driven Claire to late-night labs when her car had failed, caught her sleeve and offered a hand that wasn't a statement but steadiness. There was a pause in the cathedral, a frame of time where the world inhaled and did not yet exhale. It felt, briefly, like reprieve. But the Hartwells had not intended to allow pity. Amanda leaned forward again and began to narrate Claire's supposed faults, how she had been an interloper in their world, how she had pretended to be someone she was not. The sentences spilled like polished stones, each one meant to bruise and then be cast away. And then, because spectacle demands a punctuation, someone reached for the champagne bottle. It tipped. The liquid flew like a comet and landed on Claire's dress as if to mark the moment physically. The pearls at her neckline trembled with the wet. People gasped, not out of revulsion, but as if they've been watching a slow-motion accident they could not look away from. The organist, perhaps unconsciously, struck a discordant chord that made the stained glass tremble with nothing but reflected sound. Claire stood in all of this, hands clenched, at the hymnal. She could not move. Her body remembered how to survive, which is not the same as remembering how to be brave. Inside, something tautened a refusal to let their laughter be the final word. Her vision narrowed but did not blacken. The world simplified into choices. Hold, breathe. Do not let them see the final thing they seek, which was to reduce her to silence. At that precise, disastrous moment, as Amanda's laughter climbed and the murmurs found a rhythm, footsteps reached the back door of the cathedral. They were measured, not hurried. The sound was like a drumbeat that promised arrival. Heads turned because now there was more to look at than the collapse. The camera phones shifted focus. The murmurs pivoted from the act to the interruption. Doors opened. Air moved differently when a threshold is crossed. The temperature of the room seemed to change. As if someone had switched the light, a figure appeared in the doorway, flanked not by the sort of ordinary ushers who smoothed programs but by people who moved through the world with a decisiveness you could almost see. Security, not social presence. They were not a rescue team in the melodramatic sense. They were a presence that implied resources. They filled the entrance like punctuation. A hush fell that was not purely shock. It was the hush of people who are suddenly reminded that the story they are watching has more pages than they thought. Gavin's smile, which had been so precisely applied, faltered as if he'd been surprised by an uninvited clause in his own script. Amanda's laughter dropped as if someone had cut the thread that made her comfortable. The priest, whose voice had become a cadence, now interrupted, looked toward the doorway with a tilt of his head that suggested curiosity and confusion. Claire's mother saw them first because mothers are inventors of acronyms for danger. She began to stand and then seemed to falter, a small sound like a stone breaking. The people with authority at the door moved to the aisle, not with the theatricality of a film, but with the contained force of people who are used to making decisions on sight. The cathedral seemed to compress around them. The hush tightened. For Claire, everything became a series of sharpened images. The glint of security badges, the way a man in a dark suit reached into his coat, the shocked whiteness of marble, Gavin's hand still in motion from the act of unmasking a life she had hoped would be shared. The crowd's energy shifted from cruelty to recalibration, the way one redirects a river when an unexpected dam appears upstream. The sound of the doors opening again was a low boom, not theatrical, but like the closing of a long, latent cycle. People leaned in because it was the only sensible thing to do. No one in that cathedral wanted to miss the moment when whatever came through the threshold would rewrite the narrative, the plan, the mathematical cruelty, the rehearsal of humiliation. Whatever had seemed so carefully choreographed met an uninvited variable. And then the figures stepped forward, not yet named, not yet explained, but the gravity they carried made the floor seem to tilt toward them. The camera phones lowered because suddenly the story was not about a public unmasking but about who had chosen to enter. Tension coiled like a sound with teeth. A man in the suit made a sound of recognition low enough that only those close could hear. It was an intake. The breath before a verdict. The hush broke into 100 small sounds, murmurs, the shifting of feet, someone whispering, "Who are they?" Claire felt her ribs loosen, as if some locked mechanism had clicked. People looked at her as if they could read in her face some instruction she had not yet given. She did not feel triumphant. She felt small, wary, and very, very exposed. The room held its breath because the next beat would decide whether this ruin would be final or merely a prelude. Outside, the wind picked up like a page turning. The cathedral doors were a frame, an image ready to be filled. The guests leaned forward, waiting for the name, the reveal, the verdict that would either bury the Hartwells' intentions or make them master playwrights of humiliation. The priest's eyes flicked from the aisle to the doorway, an unconscious prayer at the edge of his lips. Claire's fingers were white on the hymnal, and in that grip there was something like a promise not to gloat, not to exact vengeance, but to remember. He stepped forward before anyone could name him William Bennett, not with the flair of a man who needed applause, but with the quiet certainty of someone whose arrival rearranged the room. He crossed the nave like a fact, asserting itself. The security men at his sides were efficient, unsmiling, the kind of presence that made people recalibrate their posture. He was smaller up close than the rumors suggested, not in stature but in a way that made his precision feel personal rather than theatrical. His jacket bore no logo. His hands were folded like a man who kept things measured. "This is my daughter," he said, and the sentence dropped into the cathedral like a verdict. It carried no plea. It was an assertion of identity, of rights, and it moved through the crowd with the weight of someone announcing an inconvenient truth. The words stopped the church in a way the champagne splash had failed to. Gavin's jaw tightened. Amanda's smile thinned. People craned their necks toward a name that suddenly reframed everything they had witnessed. What followed was not melodrama, but a series of practical motions. William did not shout. He did not demand apologies as if striking a gavel. He showed credentials only when necessary. A business card in a hand that trembled with contained enough power to make those around him aware that he could call doors to open or close. His voice was steady, but under it was an unmistakable note. He had chosen to arrive now. Claire felt the sound of his voice inside her like a tide. It was not the warm, impromptu rescue she'd secretly hoped for in a child's daydream. It was adult, deliberate, and complex. His eyes found hers. No stage performance, no tender cinematic reunion. There was recognition, and then assessment. As if he were simultaneously reading a dossier and seeing the daughter who had once run to the sandbox. For a flicker, Claire saw the private man who had once written long, careful letters. Then the same man folded that past into the decision he was making in front of 200 strangers. "Mr. Hartwell," William addressed Richard with a civility that had a blade beneath it. He did not shout, but every syllable landed like a pebble thrown into a pond. The ripples would reach beyond that room. "Your actions tonight are unacceptable. This ceremony will not continue." Richard's face, which had been a practice mask of calm all week, crumpled in a near. He opened his mouth to answer like a man cost accounting for a missing ledger. But the words dried when he met William's look. Somewhere in his head, the arrangement he'd planned, the arithmetic of reputation for cash, collapsed into a more personal embarrassment, exposure, the sudden knowledge that the person he'd used as an instrument was the child of a man who moved differently in the world. Gavin tried to recover with the old, arrogant smirk. "There were reasons," he began. the rehearsed cadence of a man who thought logic would fix shame. He reached for a phrase that had been practiced in boardrooms where feelings are The words failed. William did not need to shout to be heard. He simply instructed his security to stand between Clare and the Hartwells. Men in dark suits moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Not to stage a scene, but to maintain one simple order: no further humiliation. The ushers, uncertain how to proceed, found themselves directed to enable space to make an aisle wider in which the consequence could unfold. The priest, bewildered but bound to decorum, whispered to a deacon who made the sign of a cross as if to ward the administrative from the sacred. The congregation, which had been transfixed by a spectacle of cruelty, now watched an equally intimate show. Power asserting protection in a public arena. Cameras panned. Not instruments of shame now, but instruments of testimony. For Clare, the movement felt less like rescue and more like a reconfiguration of a life she'd tried to live quietly. Clare Hermotha began, voice bracing in a way that was both relief and accusation. But William put a hand gently on her shoulder. It was a father's touch, careful and a little late. He had watched and waited. He had not intervened earlier. That truth would sit between them, an aftertaste of method and motive neither of them could easily ignore. "Listen to me," William said to the room, and this time the cadence was direct. "This family will be removed. We will press charges for assault. We will also pursue whatever civil remedies are necessary." He did not elaborate on legal mechanisms. He did not need to. The implication was clear. There would be consequences the Hartwells had not planned for. Amanda's expression shifted from smugness to panic. Gavin, who had imagined a public ritual of cleansing his choices, realized he had stepped off a stage and into an arena he had not anticipated. Richard's pleas were weak and sounded small in that vast space. Gavin's mother, who had been venomous with refined satisfaction, suddenly had nothing to say. Social capital, the currency she'd relied on, had no immediate bite. A man in a navy suit tapped his phone and spoke in low tones. Within minutes, police officers arrived, not in dramatic numbers, but in just enough presence to turn whispers into recorded statements. The officers did not interrupt the sanctity of the space unless necessary. They asked questions, took notes, and critically took statements from witnesses who had once been complicit by their silence. The Hartwells, who had planned a carefully curated narrative about irreconcilable differences, found themselves recorded arguing in a church, their words now archival. None of this unfolded like a cinematic court triumph. It was quieter, more corroding. The Hartwells were escorted out separately, disgraced, moving past gawking guests who had only minutes earlier been celebrating. Cameras flashed, some guests cried, others averted eyes, unsure how to be human in aftermath. Clare watched, as the people who'd orchestrated her humiliation were moved not by public groans or theatrics, but by an orderly procession that would now have effects extending beyond immediate reputation. After they were gone, William crossed the nave and stood before Clare. There were no grand gestures, no sweeping apology on behalf of the world. No teatrico imbrasi. He looked at her with an intensity that had been holding behind his restraint. "Are you hurt?" he asked simply. The question was practical. Clare realized then that he cared first for her physical well-being, which felt almost shockingly normal. "No," she said. The word was small and hollow and true. Her voice was steady because she'd learned to study it in labs and lecture halls and on nights when rent was due. But the steadiness was a hard-earned armor, not peace. He took her hand, not for show but because it was what fathers do when sorting risk. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in many years the apology was not a letter. It was immediate, flawed, and human. He did not explain the test then. He did not justify his decision. He only stood with her in the ruin, a presence that complicated what had been done and the means by which it had been revealed. She felt, under the shuffle of relief and rage, the old ache of being used as the memory of his instruction, the admonition, to let them show themselves, settled heavily. There was cunning in his strategy, yes, but there was also a personal calculus. He had chosen to let her face what others revealed of their souls, rather than shield her from every indignity. The decision had been paternal and invasive. There was no simple moral center to it. "Why didn't you?" Clare began, and then stopped. The question had too many edges. She was tired of arguing moral philosophy in the middle of a storm. She wanted, instead, to know why he had chosen this form of intervention. William's mouth tightened. He had expected this. Perhaps he opened it, not to defend but to speak in a smaller voice. "I wanted you to be seen for you," he said. "I wanted to know who they were when they thought you had nothing behind you. I didn't want to make you into something you hadn't earned on your own." There were reasons between his breath. Calculation, regret. Clare heard them all, like layered instruments in a minor chord. "It still used me," she said. The statement was not accusatory so much as a map of truth. "You put me on a stage." He did not try to unmake that. He acknowledged, quietly, that the method was morally complicated. "You're right," he said. "It's not a kindness. I misjudged the boundary between protecting and using you as a measure." Clare wanted to say she forgave, because it would have been simpler, kinder. Instead she said, "I don't know what I want." It was honest, and that honesty made the conversation feel less like a concession and more like a place to move from. Outside the cathedral, the world was already doing what it does best, converting spectacle into headlines. Within an hour, social media accounts had clipped the moment of the champagne splash, the torn veil, the look of stunned betrayal. By midday, commentary pieces debated the Hartwells' tactics and the ethics of wealth. News anchors speculated on the ripple effects for the Hartwell firm. There was an uglier current to trolls, anonymous messages, petty cruelty packaged as opinion, but the dominant strain in public conversation was shock and, in places, solidarity. The Hartwell Company's stock, which had been teetering on investors' nerves for weeks, experienced a contraction of confidence. Major clients requested meetings. Board members called emergency sessions. No single tweet could topple a firm in an instant, but the scene had created a cascade of practical effects. Clients who had tolerated reputational risk suddenly evaluated it anew. Board whispers turned into executive action, as they do in any house where money speaks in a language more persuasive than ego. Inside Hartwell's marble offices, executives scrawled contingency plans, legal teams prepared damage control statements, and PR drafted lettered apologies that would later be delivered with the clinical warmth of corporate hands. Richard, who had thought the evening's cruelty was a tidy investment in salvage, found that his humiliation had metastasized into leverage elsewhere. Colleagues who had once deferred to him began circumspect conversations about his judgment. The arithmetic he'd signatures was now replaced by calculus he had not wanted. How to reassure investors that no further reputational fires would ignite. For Clare, the noise outside the cathedral mattered and did not. She sat with her parents in a small room William had arranged. The three of them sifted against a quiet that felt almost merciful after the day's dissonance. Her mother held her hand. Her father sat near, folded in thought. The practical had been handled. The Hartwells escorted out. Statements made but the internal work of reorientation had only begun. In the days that followed, Clare's life shifted not into celebrity, but into a different kind of publicness she hadn't sought. She was invited to speak at Riverside, not as a trophy, but as a witness. Students responded with messages she'd never imagined, and some told stories of small humiliations. Others offered simple solidarity. Professors invited her to advisory panels. A few old friends reconnected, their voices trembling as they apologized for not seeing sooner. Some offers arrived, opportunities in industry, possibilities in research, but nothing she felt compelled to accept immediately. She wanted to make choices on her own terms now. The thought of taking another path because others insisted felt like repeating the very dynamic she'd battled. Gavin's name circulated in gossip columns for a while, then faded as new scandals took center stage. He made a statement about personal reflection and grown-up decisions, words that attempted to neuter responsibility behind the language of self-improvement. He left town for a short while, and where he went and whether he recovered his social footing were topics of speculation. Richard Hartwell's role in the plan became public knowledge as witnesses spoke and private messages leaked. Amanda's Instagram was suddenly a less curated place. Comments ranged from vitriol to incredulous pity. What was most striking, perhaps, was how unwilling the public was to let the Hartwells' cruelty stand as a private act. People wrote op-eds about class, about the terror of being judged by origin. Online communities raised money for a foundation Clare had not yet decided whether to start. The story became less about a ruined wedding and more about a pattern, the ways institutions and families weaponize social standing and the loneliness of those who find themselves targeted. Clare read the headlines with the detachment of someone watching a lecture in which she was a subject. She learned, too, the hard fact that public sympathy is complicated. It can be powerful and performative all at once. She accepted offers to speak because she wanted to change the conversation from spectacle to structural. She found that audiences leaned in when she described the small economies of China, the way people on scholarship budgets count coffee purchases as decisions, the way doors opened for others but not always for her. Her voice, which had been trained in labs and lectures, took on a new timbre when the subject was dignity rather than algorithms. Back at home, the Bennett household had its own reckonings. William and Clare had long, halting conversations about his methods. He apologized, again and again, not as a ritual but as an attempt to rebuild trust. He was not trying to erase the past, he was trying to explain why he had let it play out. There were nights when Clare lay awake and imagined different endings. One where he had told her everything early. Another where she had never met Gavin. Yet another where she'd walked away from the altar before anyone touched the veil. None felt entirely right. Life, she realized, is messy at the seams. There were practical reconciliations too. William made sure the Hartwells faced consequences proportionate to their actions. Statements were sent. Civil processes were instigated where appropriate, and his counsel ensured that witnesses had secured channels to speak. He did not orchestrate a public humiliation of his own. He refused a public spectacle that would have mirrored the cruelty he condemned. He used power to protect, not to enact revenge. That distinction mattered to Clare. She saw in his restraint a kind of discipline that refused to answer cruelty with spectacle. Yet she never entirely forgave the decision to use her as a test. How could she? That would be a simple absolution of strategic, but instead, she accepted a more complex truth. Parents sometimes make choices in the name of protection that feel like betrayals. She also recognized that the Hartwells had chosen cruelty deliberately. That choice was on them, not her. It was important, she thought, not to collapse those two truths into an easy moral. Months later, when the immediate news cycle had softened, Clare returned to campus to give a talk about dignity and access. The auditorium was packed, not with people who wanted gossip, but with students who wanted to understand how to navigate environments that judged origin more than merit. She spoke plainly about the power of small acts of kindness and the cost of indifference. She did not make the talk about vengeance. She talked about recognition and system change, about scholarships that didn't come with social price tags, about mentors who took time for students who did not already know the language of networking. People approached her afterward with stories of their own, some small, some unbearably large. She listened, like she always had, because listening had been the skill that got her through labs and lonely nights. There were tempting paths she refused. Many wanted her to use the newfound attention as a platform for retribution, to chart a course of social takedown. She declined, not out of sacrifice to the public image of forgiveness, but because she understood the corrosive satisfaction that would bring. She did not want to become someone who repaid cruelty with a spectacle of her own. She wanted to build structures, scholarships, mentorship programs, safe reporting spaces that reduced the power of social humiliation. That is the kind of slow work that does not trend on social feeds, but changes individual lives. Still, the personal wound did not vanish. There were nights when Clare would catch herself recoiling from compliments as if they were knives, and mornings when she woke, hyper-vigilant, scanning faces for the twist of disdain she had learned to identify. Grief, she realized, does not always look like we expect. Sometimes, it looks like a string of small, private misgivings about belonging. Occasionally, on quiet evenings, she would walk past the river, where she and Gavin had once talked about futures. She would notice how the lamplight made the path forgiving, and how the city hummed along, indifferent and infinite. Those walks slowed her, taught her to measure breath, and not to be hurried into choices by the echoing of past pain. She began to date again, slowly, and with new boundaries. Not everyone she met needed to know everything at once. She chose to reveal the shape of her life in ways that felt safe and authentic. When people asked if she planned to press charges or to pursue lengthy legal retribution, she gave answers that were careful. There were consequences, she would say. People were held accountable in ways that mattered. She did not enumerate them. She refused to convert the moment into a checklist of punishments. What mattered to her was the dignity restored in that cathedral, not the humiliation traded in the tabloids. Richard Hartwell's plans collapsed under their own logic. A man who had thought the arithmetic of humiliation could be controlled found the returns to be only losses. The board removed him from his presiding position for cause, citing judgment and reputational risk. That was corporate language for a fall he could not finesse away. Amanda retreated from the social pages and the network of curated influence. Some friendships evaporated as people recalculated their alliances. Gavin, left to reckon with the social consequences of his actions, learned that some doors do not swing back open simply because you ask. In quieter corners of the city, the story took other shapes. A local nonprofit that helped students from low-income backgrounds saw donations increase after Claire spoke about her experience. Former classmates who had once felt isolated found a community formed around mutual respect rather than spectacle. The ripple, in some ways, was the best possible outcome. The humiliation did not become the final sentence, but a pivot into change. Years later, when asked what she had learned, Claire said something that was both simple and complicated. Power reveals itself in the small choices, she explained. Not only in the big headlines, it's in how you treat the intern, how you discuss someone's background at dinner, how you decide whether a person merits kindness when nothing is to be gained. Her voice carried the patience of someone who had watched the machinery of class and decided she would use whatever influence she had to alter its gears, not to grind them down. Her relationship with her father evolved into a more honest partnership. He apologized in ways that mattered, not grand gestures but consistent behavior. He invited her into conversations instead of using her as an experiment. She set boundaries he respected. They rebuilt a connection that held both affection and accountability. It was not perfect, but it was real. The cathedral incident became a story that people told with different emphases. Some framed it as a billionaire's dramatic entrance. Others told it as a cautionary tale about old money and its Claire preferred a quieter retelling. A reminder that dignity is not a trait to be bestowed by the powerful, but something everyone owes each other. She would never forget the horror of that afternoon. The way fabric tore, the sting of betrayal, the cold concrete of a public floor, memories, like stamps on her life. But she also carried forward the way people reached out. A nurse who offered to, a classmate who sent a book with a note, a professor who defended her in meetings. Those smaller, human choices, stitched differently. At the end of that year, someone asked Claire whether she felt the reveal being known publicly as William Bennett's daughter had been a liberation or a new kind of burden. She thought of privacy as a commodity and of identity as a collection of choices. It's a strange kind of freedom, she said slowly. There's power in being known by your truth, rather than by a curated fiction. But with that comes responsibility to be careful with influence and to make sure it's not used to punish, only to protect. She often returned, privately, to a question her mother had asked once. Would you have done anything differently? Claire would look back at the moments that had assembled into that day. The choice to hide, the choice to trust, the choice to stand at the altar despite unease. She admitted there were things she might change but not to erase the pain. Instead, she'd change to prevent others from experiencing it. To teach, to provide shelter, to be a voice for those whose stories were folded into private silence. The Hartwells' downfall became a cautionary note in business circles about hubris and short-sighted salvage tactics. The story was taught, in some places, as an example of the moral hazard of treating people as instruments in a ledger. But for Clare, the lesson was closer and more personal. She had learned the cost of searing humiliation, the complexity of a father's love that could become strategy, and the small but stubborn power of choosing dignity over revenge. On quiet nights, when the city settled and the river reflected the sky without comment, she would think of younger students hunched over textbooks in dorm rooms, counting pennies and piecing futures. She would imagine a different world, one in which kindness did not come with strings and in which the test that matters is not whether someone can be used but whether they are treated as fully human. So what would you have done if you were Clare? Would you have walked away before the vows, refused the test, revealed everything, and risked perceptions changing the course of your life? Or would you have stayed to see how people behaved when tempted? The question is not merely hypothetical. It's a lens to look at how we treat each other in small moments. If this story struck a chord, leave your thoughts below. What would you have done? And what changes would you make in a world that still measures people by origin? Subscribe for more dramatic real-life style stories with unexpected twists and lessons that linger.